Welcome everybody to the WRS seminar and the Headwaters lecture hosted by the Water Resources Center at the University of Minnesota. We're very pleased today to have Dr. Kelly Cobourn, who's a professor of environmental economics at Virginia Tech. And I'll turn the podium over to Dr. Jeff Peterson, who's the director of the Water Resources Center, and he'll give a more detailed introduction for our speaker.
Thank you, David, and welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. And yes, those of you who are have been in the WRS program or around the university may know that we, about twice a year, this WRS seminar coincides with a Headwaters lecture. The Headwaters lecture series is something that our center started a couple of years ago, and the intent is to bring successful researchers who are doing, innovative work at the intersection of multiple disciplines on water to interact with our water community here, including students. We're, of course, doing this like a lot of events this year. This is a virtual visit, so we appreciate Dr. Cobourn being willing to do that. We're really pleased, as David said, to have Kelly Cobourn with us today. She's associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation, and also has a number of affiliate appointments with different programs there at Virginia Tech. She's affiliate faculty with Agricultural and Applied Economics, with the Center for Global Change, and part of the Water Resources and Policy Management program, which is an undergraduate program not unlike our WRS program in content. Kelly and I have known each other for a number of years. We have similar backgrounds and sort of overlapping research interests. Her PhD is in agricultural and resource economics. Like mine, she got her degree at University of California, Davis. And Kelly has done some really widely known and impactful work that integrates economic models and econometric tools with corresponding tools and approaches from a number of different fields in environmental sciences. A lot of her work has been on water, both water quantity and water quality, number of studies on surface water, groundwater interactions, but she's done work in a wide range of environmental sciences, science fields too, connecting them with economics, including invasive species, pest control, and others. I believe her talk today is on a recent project that she's leading, sponsored by NSF, the Coupled Natural Human Systems Program. And it's a project that I'm sure will be of interest to a lot of us in Minnesota. It's about lakes and how people impact lakes and how lakes impact people. And it's a really academically diverse team. I just pulled out a paper, one of the papers from that project, and the co-authors are from agronomy, hydrology, ecology, economics, sociology, and I think data science, and I'm probably missing some. So anyway, Kelly has a lot of experience with this interdisciplinary research, and we are pleased to have her here. Welcome, Kelly.
Great, thank you so much. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, so I'm really glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking about work that I've done with a number of collaborators, looking at modeling feedbacks between coupled natural and human systems in lake catchments. Okay. So I want to start this talk by comparing two different lakes. So these are all photos on this slide of Lake Sunapee, which is located in New Hampshire. This is a pristine oligotrophic lake in a predominantly forested watershed. And I think that this lake serves as a shining example of the many ecosystem services that lakes provide that support human well-being. So this lake is a well-known source of aesthetic beauty. It offers opportunities for recreation, and it offers even access to clean drinking water for many of the homes located on its shores. So we can contrast this with photos of Lake Mendota, which is located in Wisconsin. Mendota is a eutrophic lake in a watershed that has long been dominated by agriculture and urban and exurban development. In summers, Lake Mendota routinely sees cyanobacterial blooms, beach closures, and anoxia, and other effects that compromise the ecosystem services provided by the lake. So what I think these two contrasting cases say something about is the fact that at the same time that we rely on the crucial services that freshwaters provide, we know that the choices that we collectively make lead to water quality degradation. Okay, so ultimately this project is about understanding both the provision of ecosystem services and the way that humans interact with lakes to influence water quality over time. So this type of degradation in lake water quality is a global phenomenon and one that is by all accounts worsening. A recent paper that was published in Nature documents a global trend towards increase in summer peak bloom intensity in lakes worldwide. So this occurs in 68% of the lakes studied in this paper. All of the lakes in pink and red are lakes with increasing intensity of phytoplankton blooms. Okay. In the US alone, the increased prevalence of freshwater blooms has resulted in significant economic losses, estimated to be at more than $4 billion per year, primarily from harm to aquatic food production and losses in recreation and tourism, as well as compromised drinking water supplies. So although evidence sort of broadly points to the ongoing degradation of freshwater lakes, the factors driving that degradation remain unclear. Okay, so lots of long-term water quality monitoring data and many studies in the literature demonstrate that higher nutrient loads generally result in decreased water quality. Yet in their global survey, the recent authors of that Nature paper find that temporal trends do not track consistently with fertilizer use or land use trends. So more and more evidence is pointing towards the importance of not just land use on its own, but the complex interactions that occur between lake warming and nutrient loading as drivers of eutrophication. Okay. So ultimately what this project is about is understanding the drivers behind changing lake water quality, which are essential to designing sound environmental policy to protect these valuable freshwater resources. But in lake systems, as many of you I'm sure know, this is particularly challenging because water quality depends on a number of complex system feedbacks. So we know that lake responses to changing nutrient inputs can have decadal to yearly time lags, and they also show evidence of hysteresis and other nonlinearities that are difficult to model and capture. So we're trying to understand changes in lake water quality over time. The approach that we're going to take to looking at this problem is to use coupled natural and human systems modeling as a tool to understand how feedbacks between people and lakes shape water quality dynamics across space and over time. So I'm largely going to focus on what CNHS looks like in lake catchment systems and how we approach modeling this in practice. So just sort of like from a conceptual perspective, a defining feature of coupled natural human systems is this two-way feedback between humans and nature. Okay, so we think that lake catchments are particularly illustrative of these feedbacks. So in particular, we know that human decision-making throughout watersheds surrounding lakes alters nutrient loading. Okay. We know that nutrient loading has the potential to affect water quality, either alone or through complex interactions with other elements in the system that influence lake water quality. Okay. We know that the resulting change in lake water quality matters to people and that it has the potential to affect human well-being by altering the provision of lots of different types of ecosystem services. Okay. And we know that these changes in well-being have the potential to motivate behavioral change that can potentially alter freshwater quality into the future. Okay. So what we're concerned with in this project is trying to get at this full feedback loop between humans and lake systems. When we think about this feedback loop, we actually had a number of graduate students involved in the project who co-authored a paper looking at current CNHS studies in the literature of freshwater systems. And what they found is that a large number of studies in this literature look at how human decisions affect nutrient loads, okay, entering into lakes. Fewer studies track how that translates into water quality, right? The translation between nutrient loads and water quality isn't one-to-one. So there's a need to carry nutrient loads through the lake layers with a limnological model to look at how different metrics of water quality change. There are studies that look at how changes in water quality that affect ecosystem services and human well-being, though certainly fewer than look at the first portion of the diagram, okay? And where the literature really falls short is that there are a paucity of studies looking at how these welfare effects, how changes in water quality can influence behavior and how that behavior can ultimately help to reshape lake water quality dynamics in the future. Okay. So again, we're really concerned with trying to represent and get at this full feedback loop in this study and to consider all of the aspects of the system. So ultimately, our main objective in this project is to link disciplinary models of both natural systems and human systems that we think are key in freshwater lake catchments, and to use those linked models to identify the key pathways by which humans influence water quality, and conversely, how water quality impacts human welfare and behavior. So our focus really is on the feedbacks between these system components and the coupling of models. I'm going to be talking about this problem from a pretty high level today, thinking about how the different pieces of the system fit together and not necessarily doing a deep dive on any one element of the system. Okay. So what I'll talk about today are two supporting objectives that we address, which are first to develop a conceptual model of feedbacks between pieces of the lake catchment system. Okay. And then to look at exploring these feedbacks empirically by coupling disciplinary models. So this is a particular approach that we've chosen to the problem in order to preserve the disciplinary integrity of some existing models and some new models we created, but also to get at the coupling linkages between them. So what I'll first talk about is the conceptual model of lake catchments. So we started by defining the key elements of our system and how they fit together to create this full feedback linkage between humans and lakes. So we can start with our lake catchment, which is a really nice CNHS study system because it has a relatively well-defined boundary that's based on topography and hydrology. Okay. So it's a sort of a neat system in the grand scheme of things. We know that humans make land use decisions throughout the catchment related to land use in agriculture, residential development, and forestation and deforestation that can affect nutrient loading and runoff into the catchment's water system. Okay. Those land use decisions and the sediment and nutrients that are sort of leached and run off through those processes are going to be transported by the hydrologic system downstream into the lake. Okay. So we want to consider how hydrological processes transport nutrients and sediment and convert those into inflows coming into the actual lake system. Okay. Once nutrients are in the lake, those nutrient loads interact with other factors to drive changes in lake water quality. So we'll consider the limnology here and think about how nutrient loads are converted into different metrics of water quality. We're particularly going to focus on aspects of water quality that we believe that humans can observe and respond to in ways that we can detect. Okay. So we're concerned with how changes in lake water quality affect ecosystem services that people value. So some ways that they might affect human systems are by altering recreation and tourism opportunities or by affecting property values around the perimeter of the lake. We expect that people might be willing to pay a higher property price for a home that's on a relatively clean lake versus one that's eutrophic. Okay. But there are other cultural and social effects as well. People often identify with lakes in a way that's important to them that is difficult to measure using typical economic tools. And in particular, one of the things that we see in our lake systems is that people often voluntarily organize into collective action organizations. Okay. In particular, we see lake associations around a number of lakes. So these are typically groups composed of volunteers and citizens living around a lake who come together in some sort of fashion to try to influence and preserve lake water quality in a lake that they care about. So we're going to consider also civic engagement by citizens in the lake catchment to try to influence lake water outcomes. Okay. I'll talk in a few minutes about the pathways by which these organizations operate. But of course, one of the things that they are ultimately trying to do is to shape water quality in the future. And one of the paths that they can do that is through influencing policies and regulations for land use. Okay. Of course, all of these systems sit within the catchment, which is defined by its own catchment-specific characteristics, including soil, topography, and climate. So we also want to consider the context within which humans and natural systems are operating. So when we look at this conceptual model, we're starting to get at the feedback linkages between these systems and thinking about how they tie into one another. So we have our land use to lake connection in the green arrow. We have lake water quality influencing humans in the orange arrow, okay? And then ultimately through this collective action linkage, we have humans feeding back into the way that land use decisions are undertaken throughout the catchment, okay? And then finally, we're going to look at how we can sort of scale up and extrapolate our understanding of individual lake catchments to understand more broadly how human and natural systems interact to drive lake water quality outcomes across space and over time. So I'll shift now to talk about how we're going to take that conceptual model and think about moving into an empirical model by building out those different components and the linkages between them. So on the empirical side, we are going to be looking at what we have is we have access to a database of a large number of lakes, thousands of lakes in the Northeast and Central US. Okay. So this is a database called Lagos that was developed by our colleague, Pat Serrano at Michigan State University. And so this gives us sort of the spatial and temporal variation in lake water quality measurements that we're going to use later in the empirical analysis. Okay. Within that, we're going to develop linked or coupled disciplinary models of the lake catchment CNHS in the context of two in-depth study sites. So coming back to the lakes I used at the beginning of the presentation, we'll be looking at oligotrophic Lake Sunapee in New Hampshire and eutrophic Lake Mendota in Wisconsin. Okay. So these are interesting lakes to study. They've been studied quite a bit already. There are lots of data available to look at systems in these catchments. Part of what makes these two lakes appealing as in-depth study sites is that they do have some commonalities. Mendota and Sunapee are both relatively large. They're glacially formed lakes at a similar latitude, and they both have summer stratification, winter ice cover, and inflows that are predominantly fed by surface waterways. However, there are also important differences between the two lake catchments. In particular, the catchment surrounding Mendota differs significantly from Sunapee in the sense that Sunapee is predominantly forested. Okay, whereas Mendota is predominantly in developed land and agriculture. Okay, Mendota has a long history of agricultural production, particularly row crops and livestock. Most of the development around the perimeter of the Sunapee to date has been the construction of homes for relatively affluent New Yorkers. Okay. There are also, in addition to differences in the composition of land use surrounding the lakes, of course, their trophic states differ. Okay, and along with that, we see very different levels of concentrations of total nitrogen and total phosphorus in the two lakes, and differences in clarity. These two lakes also have lake associations that we've been working with as part of the project. The Lake Sunapee Protective Association and the Clean Lakes Alliance. So part of our study is looking at how those lake associations function and what it is they try to do to influence lake water quality outcomes within their catchments. Thinking about moving from this pretty high-level conceptual model into the empirical model, I want to walk you through decisions that we made about the components of the system that we're modeling, okay, the models that we use, and a little bit about the feedback linkages between them, just from a very sort of high level. Okay. So I'm going to throw this diagram out there, but we're going to walk through it. So I know there's a lot going on here. So we had to decide which processes within the system we thought were going to be most important to model within the Lake Mendota catchment and the Lake Sunapee catchment. Okay. So we made decisions, of course, we're constrained by budget and personnel and time. So all of those factor into our decisions as well. But ultimately, we're trying to capture what we think are sort of key systems and processes that are going to influence lake water quality. So when we think about land use decisions, what we're modeling in our CNHS modeling effort is agricultural land management decisions. So we're primarily looking at decisions by farmers about crop rotations and fertilizer use. Okay. We're going to combine that with a terrestrial nutrient cycling model called Cycles Biome BGC in order to look at how those land management decisions affect nutrient leaching and runoff. When we look at the hydrologic processes and transport of those nutrients and sediment into the lake, we're going to be using a particular hydrologic solute transport model called PIM, which is the Penn State Integrated Hydrologic Model, to model water budgets and nutrient loads as they arrive at inflows to Lake Mendota and Sunapee. For the aquatic nutrient cycling component, we're using a model called GLM, the General Lake Model. And we're going to use that model to look at how changes in nutrient loads translate into changes in water quality metrics that we think are particularly likely to feed back into human systems. And we've done a little bit of testing for that. But we think that water clarity and chlorophyll A concentrations as a proxy for phytoplankton growth and algal blooms are both pretty good indicators of changes in water quality that humans respond to. We're then going to look at how changes in water quality affect ecosystem services. And we're looking at measuring those effects through changes in residential property values along the perimeter of the lake. So in particular, we're looking at using hedonic modeling, which we developed specifically for this project, to model property price premia associated with improved or degraded water quality. We do not explicitly model recreation in this project, and that was a decision that was primarily driven by time and budget constraints, though certainly something that we could build into the model in the future. Finally, the final piece of the model, which I think is a really unique aspect of our project and one that we've worked hard to develop, is the civic engagement component. This is our social science analysis that's led by a social psychologist here at Virginia Tech, using institutional analysis to look at how lake associations' missions change over time and the types of actions that they engage in to try to improve lake water quality. So that forms the final component in our feedback linkage between human and natural systems here. And then finally, we'll use Lagos and Bayesian hierarchical modeling to scale up and extrapolate beyond these two in-depth study sites where we're doing this whole model. Okay, we're not going to be able to do this whole model in a whole bunch of different lake catchments. Trust me, it's taken 5 years just to do the two. So we need to start thinking about how the lessons that we've learned from these in-depth studies or modeling exercises translate across space and time. Given the time that we have today, I don't want to dive into the details of how these models are coupled or what each of the models consists of. I just think that's a little bit too in the weeds for today. What I'd like to do instead is to talk a little bit about what we found in making these various coupling linkages within the system, and what are the lessons that we can start to draw out of the different pieces of the puzzle here. First, I'll talk a little bit about some of the results that we attained from coupling our land management decision-making model, which is an economic decision-making model, with the terrestrial nutrient cycling model. This is a unique component in the system because we couple them tightly. So there's two directional feedback. The terrestrial nutrient cycling model gives us information about crop yields that we think are important in how farmers make decisions about crop rotations and fertilizer use. And then we're going to simulate their management practices and feed that back into the terrestrial nutrient cycling model to look at nutrient leaching and runoff from the system. So we undertake this coupling, and one of the analyses that we conduct once we've coupled the two models is to look at how different policies to limit nitrate leaching might affect agricultural production and nutrient loads coming off of farm fields. So what we do with the coupled model is we implement a series of progressively more stringent reduction caps on nitrate leaching from farm fields. And we simulate how farmers change crop rotations, the use of fallow, and fertilizer applications in response. So what we find is that for relatively modest cuts in nitrate leaching, farmers can achieve the targeted level of leaching reductions by simply reducing fertilizer intensity. Okay, so reducing the amount of fertilizer applied. This could be less overall fertilizer. It could be distributing more fertilizer in a side dressing later in the season so that they can respond in real time to changes in crop yield. But the important lesson here is that fertilization intensity is important for relatively low policy targets. As we increase the stringency of those reductions, we see that decreasing fertilizer use isn't enough. Farmers have to start to change their crop rotations, shifting away from continuous corn into alternating corn soybean rotation, for example, or a 6-year corn alfalfa rotation. And importantly, for fairly high levels of nutrient leaching reductions, extensive fallowing is required. Okay. We find that the costs associated with larger cuts are going to be substantial because of the increased need for fallowing. So what we find in this coupled model is that the profit losses from these nitrate leaching caps can be fully offset for caps up to about 28% on average. It varies year to year depending on weather conditions. But about 28% is sort of the threshold for where you start to see substantial losses to farmers as a result of reduced nitrate leaching. We also find, interestingly, that although there are local water quality benefits to reducing nitrate leaching, there are also more widespread benefits from reducing nitrous oxide emissions. And those tend to scale proportionally with the nitrate leaching cap. So we find that there are significant co-benefits to greenhouse gas reductions, and that because those accrue more broadly to society, they can be up to an order of magnitude greater than the local water quality benefits. And that can be enough to tilt the balance of a cost-benefit analysis towards adopting a water policy that may not have been adopted based on just water quality benefits alone. Okay, so that might be something to consider. Moving to coupling the first portion of this diagram, so the agroecosystem model with the hydrologic model and the lake model, we learn a number of things about the relationship between land use, climate, and lake water quality. So first, looking at oligotrophic lake Sunapee, we find that both air temperature and nutrient loads, particularly total phosphorus loads, okay, matter to chlorophyll A concentrations, but to different summary measures. So air temperature tends to be more strongly correlated with median chlorophyll A during the summer, whereas the external phosphorus load is more highly correlated with the maximum chlorophyll A observed during the summer season. I think what's interesting from this study is that we find evidence that a temperature-nutrient interaction seems to be a more important driver, particularly of median chlorophyll A, okay, than either temperature or nutrient loading alone. So what this study suggests is that particularly in the face of climate change, it may be beneficial to pursue more aggressive nutrient reduction targets to prevent algal growth. Okay, so we are seeing evidence of this temperature-nutrient interaction in this oligotrophic system in particular. When we look at climate, land use, and water quality for Mendota, we have a study that looks at anoxia in the hypolimnion. Okay, and what we see in Mendota is that the hypolimnitic anoxia typically lasts for about 50 to 60 days per summer. So it's a fairly lengthy period. And that the drivers of that anoxia are primarily meteorological, not landscape driven. What that suggests is that we're likely with climate warming to see increased anoxia in Lake Mendota. Okay. And because that's primarily driven by external meteorological conditions, what we don't know and is an open question is sort of what is the role for management of land use and agriculture in this catchment? So that's a question that I'll come back to, but certainly one that was raised in this study. So looking at the two lakes together, we look at climate, land use, and trophic state, okay? And what we can see by comparing the two lakes is that in the relatively oligotrophic Sunapee, okay, it's more sensitive to predicted changes in air temperature. What we see is from this graphic on the right, you can see the distribution of total nitrogen, phosphorus, and the ratio between them in Mendota versus Sunapee. And these are different warming scenarios. So the warmer colors are associated with a higher degree of warming. Okay. And so what we see is that Sunapee becomes more sensitive to changes in air temperature at a lower level, okay, than Mendota. So at about 1 to 2 degrees warming centigrade, we see the distribution of NP start to shift for Sunapee. Whereas Mendota's system is relatively resilient to changes in air temperature up to about a threshold of 5 to 6 degrees centigrade. Okay. Climate warming is likely, we find, to intensify the effects of nutrient loading, particularly in an oligotrophic system. I guess if you turn that around, the eutrophic system is in some ways a little bit less sensitive or more resilient to warming temperatures. So what this study suggests is that decreased nutrient inputs may be particularly, decreasing nutrient inputs may be a particularly important policy tool to mitigate the effects of warming in oligotrophic systems. I'm going to shift to talk a little bit about the link between lakes and residential property values. Okay. So when we combine these two models, one of the things that we needed to think about is what aspects of water quality are property owners, so sellers and buyers of homes, most likely to respond to. And so part of what we did was to test whether we can detect econometrically a response in property price premia to different water quality metrics. So we look at the sensitivity of home sale prices to changes in water quality along the shores of Lake Mendota. We have not completed the analysis for Sunapee yet. But one of the things that we find is that home sale prices around Mendota do vary with water quality, okay? But that they are relatively more sensitive to changes in Secchi depth, so water clarity, than they are to chlorophyll A as a proxy for phytoplankton growth. We also find evidence of an asymmetric response in property values to nutrient loads. So particularly in Mendota, which is already starting from a eutrophic state, we find that an increase in nutrient loads carries a relatively small loss in property values relative to the gain from a decrease in loads. And we also find that relatively large reductions in nutrient loads would be required to change water quality significantly enough to drive substantial changes in property values. Okay, so we're talking about changes in nutrient loads on the order of a decrease of 50, 75, 90%. So above 50%. Generally is resulting in changes in property values on the order of 5% up to about 19%. I'm going to the final component of our loop, the civic engagement piece. Okay. Our social scientists looked at the missions and actions and organization of the lake associations associated with Sunapee and Mendota. Okay. And one of the things they considered in this study is the different actions that lake associations can engage in to try to affect water quality in the future. And there are sort of three main pathways by which these organizations try to affect environmental change: through direct action, education and guidance, advocacy and lobbying is the third pathway. Okay. And then another important activity undertaken by lake associations, which influences their ability to execute their mission, is monitoring. So given time constraints, I'm not going to get very deep in here, but these two organizations are engaged in very different motivations and missions that are related to the trophic state of the lakes that they're worried about. Interestingly, they work through entirely different avenues to try to affect water quality. So the Lake Sunapee Protective Association, which is primarily focused on preventing lake water quality degradation, works primarily through education and through direct monitoring with citizen science efforts. The Clean Lakes Alliance, which is primarily concerned with restoration and gains of an already eutrophic lake, is working primarily through direct pathways and through advocacy and lobbying. And that's related to the strength of action that's going to be required to make headway in this eutrophic system. Okay. So I know I'm speeding a little bit, but I'm getting towards the end here, and I want to be cognizant of time so that there's opportunity for questions. Okay. So the final piece here that we look at is scaling up and extrapolation. Okay. So when we look at concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus across lake catchments throughout the northeastern and central US, what we see is that lake water quality, these concentrations vary significantly, particularly with near stream agriculture. So agriculture that's located within 100 meters of a waterway within the catchment. And that's across 928 lake catchments in our extrapolation data set. But something we find that's interesting here is that there are important differences between TN and TP. So TN is generally more strongly correlated and related to agriculture, especially corn. So the predominance of corn in the lake catchment, as well as the prevalence of clay soil and the use of tile drainage. TP, in contrast, is less correlated with agriculture by a variety of different measures and more strongly related to lake characteristics, such as depth and watershed hydrology. And part of this is probably driven simply by the fact that there's a lot of legacy phosphorus, right? So we're looking at phosphorus that has resulted from land use activities decades ago, okay? As opposed to agricultural practices even lagged 10 years. So there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle here. And I think the question at the end of the day is, where does all of this leave us in our understanding of this coupled natural human system? Okay. So in eutrophic Mendota, okay, we see that large reductions in nutrient loads from agriculture are costly because they're going to require most likely fallowing or significant changes in crop production practices. But we need large reductions in TN and TP in order to generate a downstream benefit that we can detect via property values. Okay. I think that there are questions about the effectiveness of agricultural management for TN, where I think there's a very clear linkage, versus the efficacy of management for TP. So I think this is going to be a much more difficult objective to achieve via changes in agricultural production. Okay. But something that we might think about here is that there are additional gains to land use policy beyond water quality. And so when you start to think of more holistically about the gains from reduced nutrient use, including some of the greenhouse gas benefits, can be quite important. For oligotrophic sunapee, we see that these systems are likely to be more sensitive to an interaction between temperature and nutrient loads, okay? So what I think this points to in the face of climate warming is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think that this is very consistent with the types of activities that the Lake Sunapee Protective Association has been focused on with respect to prevention. So that's sort of all that I wanted to say about this system. This is definitely still a work in progress, and there are lots of pieces to pull together, but I'm happy to answer more questions. I would like to recognize a rather large team of scientists who've pulled this off, and thank the NSF for their support. And I will also point out that this last picture is evidence of how choosing your research projects strategically can benefit you because you can conduct science meetings on a boat with wine. So that's all I have to say for today, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. And we're giving you a virtual round of applause right now. I know this is different than if we were in an in-person setting. Fascinating project, and I'm sure will generate a number of questions here. We have, let's see, 10 minutes or so for questions. Those of you who are participating, you can either enter any questions that you have in the chat box, or, and I can read them to Kelly, or if you want to ask your question directly, go to the participants list, find your name. Well, no, you don't have to do that. Just click on the raise your hand button, which is at the bottom left of the participants window. And I will call on you to ask a question. So while I think people are thinking, Kelly, I'll ask you a question about, it was really interesting about the co-benefits for greenhouse gas reduction. A lot of the practices that improve water quality would reduce nutrient loadings, would also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Have you gotten as far as doing like the benefit cost analysis on that in either lake to see whether that difference is decisive, like if it pushes the benefit cost ratio past 1?
So yes, we have looked at that for Mendota, and we have found that it can, it varies a lot by year. But on average, it does have the potential to tip a cost benefit analysis to suggest adoption where you might not adopt just based on the local water quality benefits. And that's in part just driven by the sheer magnitude of the greenhouse gas emission benefits.
Right, that makes sense.
I'd like to ask a question. Kelly, thank you very much for a great presentation. I'm curious about the selection of the hydrologic water quality model, the FIM model. Is there a reason why that was used instead of maybe the SWAT model, which is a very popular model that's used for evaluating land use impacts? It's got a complete, all the complete um, types of agricultural practices and things like that. I'm just curious about that one. Maybe FIM has all those things too.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert on the hydrologic model. One of our collaborators on the project is Chris Duffy, and that is the model that he developed. My understanding of one of the benefits is that SWAT might be slightly more spatially aggregated than PIM. So part of the PIM process is breaking down the watershed into triangular mesh cells that do a really nice job of sort of capturing differences in topography throughout the watershed. And then it is also, there's already been some work done integrating that with the cycles model so that we can model a tight feedback linkage between nutrient cycling and the water budget. So those were both sort of advantages that spoke to us there. But, I will confess that, in large part that was driven by the expertise of the team that we pulled together.
I'm co-investigator with Chris on another NSF project right now, so I understand. Is that him in the picture?
Yes.
People standing in the picture, third from my right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Saleh. I have a couple of questions if I can ask those.
Yes, please do.
So at some point, in your analysis, you have used both total nitrogen and total phosphorus.
Mm-hmm.
But in lake water quality, especially the algal bloom and so on, total phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in most of the cases. So policymaker or lake management authority usually more focus on total phosphorus, that component, instead of doing total nitrogen. But that nitrogen component, some form of it, such as nitrite, has human health issue. So in that case, how do you think that you can communicate your result saying that you found both of them and how they interact? How do you recommend to policymakers that not only just think about total phosphorus, but think about both? And do you have any plan to do any analysis on how this total nitrogen on lake affecting human health and human well-being?
Yeah, so there's a couple different pieces there that I think definitely are really noteworthy. When we think about the sort of emphasis within policy audiences on phosphorus, that is something that we see carry through the Clean Lakes Alliance. So the Clean Lakes Alliance around Mendota is really focused on phosphorus. They have their sole mission at this point is to reduce phosphorus loads coming off of farm fields by, I think it's 50%, but don't quote me on that, but it's a pretty high number. But that is their sole focus. They are really not concerned about nitrogen, or have not at least articulated a concern about nitrogen in their publications and in the survey interviews that we did with them. As far as actually, let me go back to how we communicate those results with the policy audience. So, I think that I like this figure because what we see is that, the orange box portion of the box plot shows us what happens if we double total nitrogen. The light blue is if we double total phosphorus. This is in Sunapee. The dark blue is if you double both of them. And so what you do see is a significant difference in both median and maximum chlorophyll A when you double both. So I think that, this kind of graphic can be particularly helpful to start to show people that the combination of the two might have a different effect than each of them independently. So I guess not being a limnologist, that's probably how I would approach that question based on my understanding.
Yeah, I'm not a limnologist. I'm an economist by training, just like you.
Okay.
And so I have another question, like more related to economics. Like I'm thinking about the hedonic analysis that you have done in one of the lakes. Mm-hmm. So you said you have looked into water quality as like from my understanding, I find that you have two different models. In one, you use water quality or chlorophyll A as a proxy for water quality. In another model, you said Secchi depth is water quality or water clarity. So I'm thinking, like, did you consider an aggregate measure of water quality composed of not only just chlorophyll and Secchi depth? And I know that these are the two common water quality data that we find, but other water qualities data is there, but a little bit scarce. So I'm thinking, like, did you consider any aggregation of those water quality parameters to come up with a more, let's say, qualitative water quality, such as boatable or swimmable or very good water quality, and then that will lead to hedonic. So people does not really go for what's going on to total nitrogen. They don't see the nitrogen, they see other things. So I'm thinking, like, is this will be valuable to go for an aggregate water quality measure instead of going that scientific thing that people does not really readily have answer to?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this was something that we spent quite a lot of time thinking about. So, we have hundreds of output variables from the limnological model that we could potentially use to measure changes in water quality. The now faculty member used to be a PhD student on this project who did the hedonic analysis, has done some work with machine learning to try to look at which of those different output metrics we actually can see or detect in property prices. And so, in some ways, Secchi depth already is sort of an aggregation of a lot of different water quality outcomes. We don't have another way of aggregating them that we found that's meaningful. But you're right, we have to test the model with different water quality measures because they can all be very highly correlated. And so, I don't remember the results of her machine learning analysis right off the top of my head, but it's something I'd be more than happy to connect you with to ask her about if you're interested in learning more. I know Secchi and chlorophyll A it just kept coming up as the strongest signal that we could detect in property value prices.
I understand. And this is my last question, then I'll shut up. So my last question is, like, you guys have analyses on 2 lakes. And as far as I know, Lagoseni has more than 15,000 lakes. And at some point, like, you are thinking using inside of that 2 lake to extrapolate it to 14,000 lakes. I'm not sure, like, what kind of approach you are using that can lead you up scaling up from 2 lakes to that many lakes and get an insight.
Yeah, so we're not going to be able to scale up or extrapolate to the entire set of lakes that's in Lagos. So we had to think a little bit about what would be a reasonable extrapolation set or subset of those lakes. And so we ended up with about 928 lakes in the one analysis that I showed. So it is a significantly smaller subset. I think, we chose Mendota and Sunapee. They're very charismatic lakes. We have lots of data on them. There are a number of advantages to them, but they are relatively big lakes compared to many of the lakes in Lagos. So when we started to think about scaling up and extrapolation, that was an important limitation. Other limitations are just the data that we have on lake water quality. So in many lakes, we have TN and TP, but we don't necessarily have Secchi depth. or chlorophyll A concentrations. So to some extent, we're a little bit bound by data limitations there. I guess I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's kind of how we thought about approaching the problem. And it's been a very statistically driven approach to that with Bayesian hierarchical modeling.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. And I really like the presentation, especially the coupled system. And I'm very interested in system dynamics myself. So I've been working on those kind of things. So yeah, right now my focus is on water. Like next research, I'm going to do that route. And to give my background, I'm just a postdoc. Like I have graduated 2 years ago, not 2 years, last year.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in this type of field, and maybe you will hear from me later on asking for like some clarity more. Thank you very much for the presentation today.
Sounds great, thanks.
Well, thank you. And just looking at the time here, I think we're at the end of our scheduled time. If Kelly were here in person with us at this point, as I was telling her earlier, we would all dismiss to the hallway where we'd have a reception and you could talk with her informally and probably ask more questions. But perhaps as we were just talking about, if folks are interested in following up, they can contact Kelly separately. So I don't know, Dr. Mulla or Dr. Niebuhr, if you have any concluding remarks before we wind up. And I will just say thank you again, Kelly, for doing this. We really appreciated having you join us, and a really interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for moderating, and thank you, Dr. Cobourn. That was a very exciting talk. We enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
And we'll have a recording of it available later on for other people to view. So hope everybody has a really nice weekend, and talk to you later.
Thank you again for having me.
Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.